Read it in a day and take the pain away. Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I'm going to talk about some of my all-time favorite shorter books that you could conceivably read in one day, in one sitting, just really short books that you can digest in a really short amount of time. I've got 10 books to show y'all here, and I wasn't really sure what kind of order to put any of these in, so I basically just put them in alphabetical order by author's last name, and that's what we're going to go with. But anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So the first book I have to show y'all is a very short book by one of my all-time favorite authors. I normally gravitate to more of his short stories. He's my favorite short story author, but this book is very good, and that would, of course, be Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. And like I said, I mainly enjoy his short stories like The Illustrated Man, The October Country, and just a dozen or so other short story collections. But I will admit that this one, Fahrenheit 451, of course, probably most people have heard of it. It's very good. Although when I first had to read it, I think I had to read it in my freshman year of high school or something. And of course, when you're forced to read a book, or at least for me, I really don't enjoy being force-fed a book. Like, you have to read this book and you're going to be tested on it. I didn't like it then, but I reread it back when I didn't have to read for educational purposes. I just read it because I was like, hey, Ray Bradbury, I know that author. And when I read it, I really enjoyed it. And it was very good. And of course, it's got one of the most famous first lines. It was a pleasure to burn. And it's about this guy who has to burn books. And it's just one of the best dystopian sci-fi novels ever written. It's very short. It's 150 pages. You can definitely read this book in a day and get a complete story. And for anyone who hasn't read it, I would highly recommend you do so because it's very good, very important book. And yeah, for all those reasons, Fahrenheit 451, read it in a day and take the pain away. The next book I have to talk about is a book that I've recently read because my girlfriend made me read it. But I really enjoyed it, and that would be Hyperbole and a Half by Ali Broche. And this one is just a very fun graphic novel. And it looks kind of thick, but like I said, it is a graphic novel. So a lot of it is just pictures, right? And very few words on the page. So you can really get through this book fairly quickly, 2 to 3 hours. And it's really funny. It's one of the funniest books that I've read. I definitely plan on rereading this because it is very funny and it's very quick. And it's just a really good time. Me and Stacy, read this together and we were just laughing the whole time. It's a very good book. And I highly recommend it to anyone who just needs a laugh. And of course, laughter is very good medicine for pain. What is wrong with me? The next short book I have to talk about is by a very famous author who actually wrote a bunch of books before he got very famous under a different pseudonym. And that would be Binary by John Lang, aka Michael Crichton. Notice how they put Michael Crichton's name much bigger than his pseudonym. Yeah, I read this book, and I've read several of his books by, John Lang. A lot of them are fine. They're kind of forgettable and they're not great. But this one I actually really enjoyed. And of course, it's very quick. It's a little more than 200 pages. And yeah, it's just a very good sci-fi thriller, which Michael Crichton is great at that, right? And yeah, it's if you want to read like a very early Michael Crichton book and just go into it not knowing anything, because a lot of his books, they tend to get adapted, so you really know a lot about them going into it. For this one, definitely go into it not knowing a whole lot about it, and yeah, I think you'll have a good time with it. And the other crazy thing about, his John Lang pseudonym, he wrote this in like the late 60s and early 70s while he was at Harvard, like just in his downtime, I guess. Like, oh yeah, I'm going to Harvard. I'm trying to, be a doctor. And, what do I do in my spare time? Oh yeah, let's write books and get them published. That's crazy. And like I said, a lot of them aren't very good, but this one was especially good. I think I gave it like 4.5 stars. So yeah, I wanted to include this one just because this book probably doesn't get a lot of book reviews, but it's a really good time, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who just wants to read a very quick Michael Crichton book. And yeah, so for those reasons, Binary. Very short book, also very good, and you could probably read it in a day and take the pain away. The next book I have to talk about is not the scariest book I've ever read, but it's probably the creepiest book I've ever read. And I've talked about this in a few of my videos in the past, and that would, of course, be The Grip of It by Jacques Jepk. It's a very good, very short horror novel, and like I said, probably the creepiest book I've ever read. It's essentially a haunted house story where it's very typical, like you get a wife and a husband who buy a house, weird shit starts happening, and it goes from there. But the way that it's written is very unique because, like I said, it's very short. It's less than 300 pages, but it also has like 90 or 100 chapters. And you flip back and forth very quickly between the husband's and the wife's perspective. And by doing that, you create this sense of mystery and the sense of like unease because you just are constantly getting different parts of the story and they're kind of contradicting each other at times and just a bunch of weird shit's happening. It's very good and very creepy. I read this in like the middle of the night and like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I got kind of creeped out. And I'm not normally one who gets scared very easily by anything, so that should tell you something. It does have a fairly low rating on Goodreads, but a lot of my favorite horror novels have very bad ratings on Goodreads, so people are dumb. But anyway, yeah, it's one of my favorite horror novels. I'd give it like 4.5, 5 stars. Very creepy, and if you want just a really good creepy story that you could probably read in a day, because like I said, it's less than 300 pages. You could conceivably read it in a day. Check out The Grip of It. It's very good. Speaking of really good short horror stories, I'm going to have to go with my next pick, Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. And this is a very recent read for me. Stephen Graham Jones, like I've said in many videos, quickly becoming one of my favorite horror writers. And if you've seen my top 10 Stephen Graham Jones list, which I'll link down below, spoiler alert, this is my favorite. And it's very short. It's a novella length. I think it's about, it's like 130 pages. You could definitely read this in a day and get pretty creeped out. I would say this is less scary. I think it's more so on like the dark humor, black comedy sort of train. It's very good. I laughed out loud several times in this. It's about these kids who find this mannequin and they play some pranks, but one of the pranks goes completely wrong, and then something happens and everything just goes off the rail, and it's hilarious. It's pretty creepy at times, but also just very funny. So I would recommend it. It's very good. Very different from The Grip of It, but yeah, one of my favorite horror books. It's like I said, it's a novella. You can get through it fairly quickly. Definitely read it in a day. And yeah, I highly recommend it to everyone who wants to get more into Stephen Graham Jones. This next story is also a novella, and it happens to be written by my favorite author of all time, and that would be Night Flyers by George R.R. Martin. This is a very cool sci-fi horror mystery tale. It's essentially a murder mystery in space. Kind of. Essentially, what you get with this story is that you get a bunch of people going out into space and they're trying to look for this, like, very unknown and very huge space creature that, like, when it passes a planet, like, weird stuff starts happening to it. And they're trying to go out into space and actually look for it. And it's very cool, but then, once everyone gets on the spaceship, stuff starts happening, people start dying, and it's very cool. It's very weird. And George R. R. Martin, one of the reasons why he became my favorite author of all time is reading his older stuff. And this was written, I think, in like the mid 80s. It's very cool and very weird. And you can definitely read it in a day. It's a little novella. This edition is fairly cool because it has illustrations. So I would highly recommend you picking up Night Flyers. Very good, one of my all-time favorite novellas. And yeah, for all those reasons, definitely go check out Night Flyers. You can definitely read it in a day. The next book I have to talk about is also by one of my all-time favorite authors, and that would be After Dark by Haruki Murakami. Isn't that a really cool cover, by the way? Has nothing to do with anything, but I really like the cover. I think this would be a perfect place to start with Haruki Murakami if you're interested in reading some of his stuff, because like I said with a lot of these books, they're very short, and this one clocks in at like 230 pages. You could probably read this in a day, which is different than a lot of his other books, because a lot of his other books are on the longer side. Like, obviously, like 1Q84 is like 1,100 pages, and then even some of his other stuff. Wind Up Bird Chronicle is 600 pages. Kafka on the Shore, I think, is close to 500 pages. So those books necessarily aren't great starting places, but with this book, even if you don't end up loving it like I did, at least you would just be tipping your toes into Murakami and not just jumping in the deep end. Like, you could read this in a day and just test out the waters and see if his writing style would work for you. It definitely did for me. This is one of, if not the first books that I read by him, and I absolutely enjoyed it. Still one of my favorite things that he's written. And yeah, I think it's a really good place to start with him. And yeah, you can definitely read it in a day. The next book I have to talk about is by one of my all-time favorite sci-fi authors. He wrote the Themis Files, which is probably my all-time favorite trilogy of all time. And this one is actually a very short novella by him. And that would be The Test by Sylvain Neville. A very short, very fun, very thrilling novella. And yeah, I don't want to give too much away because, like, it's a novella, so you can't really give too much away without spoiling anything. But yeah, it's really good. It's just a very good, very fun sci-fi thriller novella. And yeah, you can definitely get through it in a day. It's like a little less than 100 pages. I'd also recommend the audiobook. Whoever does the audiobook, can't remember the narrator, but he did a very good job narrating the story. And yeah, I've read this twice now. Very, very good. And sorry I'm being too brief with this one, but like I said, I kind of just want y'all to jump into it, not knowing quite what it's about. That's how I like to jump into novellas anyway. But yeah, it's very good, and I highly recommend it, and you can for sure read it in a day. This next book I've talked about in several of my videos in the past, and I will continue to do so because it's one of my all-time favorite books, and that would, of course, be Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie by Jordan Sonnenblick. And, of course, very short book, and it's less than 300 pages, but on top of that, it's a middle grade book, so very huge font. Like, you can probably read this in, like, 3 hours, maybe. It's very good, and obviously I've talked about this book in length several times in a lot of my videos, so I won't go into too much detail, but I read this book in middle school. I really loved it, and this has been my most reread book ever. I've read this book several times in my life. I love it every single time. I'm going to be reading it early or later on this year, probably around my birthday like I do. And yeah, it's really good, very heartwarming, and a lot of fun. So if you want like a fun middle grade book that you've probably never read before, go check out Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie. You can for sure read it in a day. All right, and the last book I have to talk about is, again, by one of my all-time favorite authors. It's the first book in one of my all-time favorite series, and that would, of course, be I Am Not a Serial Killer by Dan Wells. Not only is this book great with one of my all-time favorite characters, it also happens to be very short. I think it clocks in around, yeah, it's like around 260 pages. So you could probably conceivably read this book in a day. Yeah, especially if you listen to the audio, narrated by, of course, my favorite narrator, Kirby Hayborn. I think it's around a 7, maybe 8 hour audio. So if you speed it up a little bit, you could probably read this in a day. I usually do when I read this book. I've read this book twice now. Very good. And yeah, one of my all-time favorite series. And if you don't know what it's about, it follows a kid, a 15-year-old boy named John Cleaver, who, he's not a serial killer, but he's very interested in serial killers, especially when a lot of murders start happening in his small town. He thinks that, oh, there could be a serial killer here. So he starts investigating, and it goes in some weird directions, but I love this book. One of the best debut novels I've ever read, and just one of my all-time favorite series. John Cleaver's one of my all-time favorite characters. Highly recommend it to anyone who wants to check it out. And like I said, with all of these books, you could conceivably read it in a day and take the pain away. All right, that wraps up this video. Read it in a day, take the pain away. These are a lot of my all-time favorite short novels or novellas by some of my all-time favorite authors. And yeah, you could conceivably read these books in a day and just have a great time with them. I know I did. Hopefully y'all find some good recommendations in this video. Also, what are your favorite books that you can read in a day? Leave them down in the comments below. Hopefully we can all get some very good suggestions from everybody. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel in the Bookish Charmer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me financially, go check out my Patreon page and see what that's all about. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and have a terrific day.